You ever notice how some people completely fall apart under pressure, while others go through absolute chaos and somehow come out stronger? Same problems, same fear, same darkness, but completely different outcomes. And that raises a terrifying question. What if demons already know something about true believers that most believers still don't understand themselves? Because according to spiritual warfare, darkness doesn't attack randomly. It targets purpose. It targets faith. It targets identity. But here's the strange part. The strongest believers are usually not the loudest people in the room. They're not always the most famous. They're not always the most religious looking. Yet somehow, darkness reacts to them differently. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what demons fear most about true believers, why spiritual attacks increase when your faith grows, and the one thing that makes darkness lose its power over your life. And trust me, the final point changes everything. Why demons fear true believers? The first thing you need to understand is this. Demons do not fear human strength. They fear spiritual authority. That changes the entire conversation. Because a true believer is not dangerous because they're perfect. A true believer becomes dangerous when they finally understand who they are spiritually. Think about a police officer for a second. The badge itself is just metal. But when people see it, they understand there's authority standing behind it. That's exactly how spiritual authority works. Demons fear believers because of the power behind their faith, not because believers are naturally stronger than everyone else. And this is where most people make a mistake. They think spiritual warfare is about trying harder, praying louder, looking more religious. But darkness is not intimidated by performance. It's intimidated by genuine faith. That's why two people can go through the same spiritual attacks and respond completely differently. One person collapses emotionally. The other stays steady, not because life is easier for them, but because their foundation is different. The power of faith that darkness hates. Faith is powerful because faith refuses to surrender to fear. And demons thrive on fear. Fear creates confusion. Fear creates hopelessness. Fear makes people spiritually passive. Once someone starts believing they are powerless, they stop resisting. And that's exactly where darkness wants them. But true believers interrupt that cycle. Now this next part might surprise you. Demons are not always trying to destroy people instantly. Sometimes the goal is simply distraction. Distraction from purpose. Distraction from prayer. Distraction from spiritual growth. Because distracted believers become weak believers. Think about how many people spend hours feeding anxiety every day, scrolling endlessly, absorbing negativity, overthinking every problem. Eventually, fear becomes louder than faith. But true believers learn how to protect their minds. And that changes everything in spiritual warfare. Because darkness cannot dominate someone who refuses to mentally surrender. Why fear gives darkness influence. Fear is one of the greatest weapons in spiritual warfare. Not because fear itself is evil, but because fear distorts perspective. Fear makes temporary problems feel permanent. Fear makes people forget who they are. Fear convinces believers that God has abandoned them. And honestly, most spiritual battles begin in the mind long before they appear anywhere else. That's why negative thoughts become stronger during difficult seasons. You start doubting yourself, doubting your purpose, doubting your future. And this is where most people lose the battle. Not physically, mentally, but true believers understand something powerful. Thoughts are not always truth. Just because fear speaks loudly doesn't mean fear is right. Imagine being inside a movie theater. The screen looks massive because the room is dark. That's how fear works. It looks bigger when there's no spiritual light. But the moment faith enters the situation, perspective changes. And demons hate believers who keep their perspective during spiritual attacks. Why prayer terrifies darkness? Let's talk about prayer for a second. Not robotic prayer, not religious repetition, real prayer. Because consistent prayer does something most people overlook. It keeps believers spiritually awake. And darkness loves spiritually distracted people. People who are emotionally drained, spiritually disconnected, mentally overwhelmed. But prayer reconnects believers with clarity. It creates discipline. It strengthens focus. It sharpens discernment. And this is why spiritual warfare often intensifies when someone starts growing spiritually. Have you ever noticed that? The moment someone gets serious about their faith, resistance increases. Suddenly distractions multiply. Problems appear. Temptations increase. That's not random. Growth threatens darkness. Because demons fear believers who become spiritually consistent, not emotionally motivated for 1 week. Consistent. There's real power in consistency. A small flashlight used daily becomes more valuable than fireworks that only explode once. And spiritually, steady faith becomes extremely dangerous to darkness. The difference between religious people and true believers. This next part is important. There's a huge difference between religious behavior and genuine faith. Religious people often focus on appearances. True believers focus on transformation. Religious people want attention. True believers want growth. And darkness knows the difference immediately. Because spiritual authority does not come from sounding impressive. It comes from authenticity. Someone can quote scripture perfectly and still live completely controlled by fear. Meanwhile, another person with simple but genuine faith can walk through impossible situations with incredible peace. Why? Because true believers actually trust what they believe. And this is what demons fear most. Real conviction, not temporary emotion, not performance. Conviction. People who continue trusting God during pain become spiritually stronger than they realize. And honestly, some of the strongest believers are people who survived seasons that should have broken them completely. That resilience terrifies darkness. Why hope is dangerous to demons. One of the most powerful weapons true believers carry is hope. Because hopeless people stop fighting. But hopeful people keep moving forward even when life becomes painful. And demons hate hope. Hope refuses to accept darkness as the final outcome. Think about every comeback story you've ever heard. At some point, everything looked finished. Everything looked impossible. But the person kept going anyway. That's exactly what happens spiritually. Darkness expects people to collapse under pressure. But true believers continue forward despite the pressure. And this next part might hit hard. Faith does not mean believers never struggle. Faith means they refuse to stay defeated. There's a huge difference. A believer may cry. They may feel exhausted. They may feel overwhelmed. But deep down they refuse to completely let go of hope. And demons cannot permanently defeat someone who keeps getting back up. The spiritual warfare happening every day. A lot of people imagine spiritual warfare as something dramatic. But honestly, most spiritual attacks happen quietly. In habits, in thoughts, in distractions, in compromise. Because darkness understands something most people ignore. Small repeated decisions shape lives. That's why discipline matters spiritually. What controls your attention eventually controls your direction. And this is where many believers struggle. Not because they don't love God, but because they slowly become spiritually numb. Constant distractions, constant noise, constant comparison. Eventually, spiritual focus disappears. But true believers learn how to guard their minds intentionally. Not perfectly, intentionally. They understand that what they feed emotionally and spiritually affects their strength during spiritual warfare. And this is why demons fear disciplined believers. Because disciplined faith is difficult to manipulate. Why identity changes everything. Here's the truth most people never realize. The biggest battle in spiritual warfare is identity. Because if darkness can make believers forget who they are, it can influence everything else. Imagine a prince growing up convinced he's poor. Even though he has authority, resources, and inheritance available to him, he lives like someone powerless. That's exactly how many believers live spiritually. They pray from fear instead of confidence. They expect defeat instead of victory. But true believers eventually understand something powerful. Their identity is not determined by fear, not determined by failure, not determined by past mistakes. And once someone truly understands that spiritually, darkness loses one of its greatest weapons. Because confident believers become harder to intimidate. What makes true believers impossible to defeat? So after everything we talked about, what do demons fear most about true believers? It's not perfection, it's persistence. A true believer may struggle. They may fail. They may experience fear, confusion, temptation, and spiritual attacks. But they refuse to surrender completely. And that's what makes them dangerous. Every time a believer chooses faith over fear, darkness loses ground. Every time a believer keeps praying despite discouragement, darkness loses ground. Every time a believer stands back up after failure, darkness loses ground. And eventually that consistency becomes spiritual strength. Remember what I said at the beginning? The strongest believers are usually not the loudest people in the room. They're the people who quietly refuse to let darkness define them. That's the thing demons fear most. Not flawless people, faithful people. And once you understand that, spiritual warfare starts looking completely different. If this video helped you understand spiritual warfare, the power of faith, and why true believers terrify darkness, make sure you like the video and subscribe, because the next video is going to reveal the hidden signs of spiritual attacks most people completely ignore until it's too late.